Hey, welcome to the channel. Today's video is going to be the first in a new series called Let's Have a Chat About Auto Parts. Really neat series that I've been wanting to put together for a little while now. In this series, I'm going to attempt to demystify some common things about auto parts, kind of make it easy to understand for everyone, maybe even cover some things you've never heard before. Hopefully, you learned something neat from this. This is culminated from the experience of many years that I've had working on many vehicles. I work on everything, so I happen to have a little collection of spark plugs here today for the first episode, and I think that this is just stuff that we all want to know about our vehicles, but just maybe never got a full explanation, maybe not in clear language that is easy to understand from either maybe the guy at the shop, maybe the guy at the parts counter. A lot of different opinions about these things that we're going to go over, including our first topic with the spark plugs today. Uh, we're going to go ahead and make sure that whether or not you're dealing with these yourself or you're taking your car to the shop, you're going to be able to make a good, confident, educated decision. Because whether or not it's going to go to the shop or you're going to take these out yourself, if they got to be replaced, you're still going to have to make a decision, or maybe a few, depending on how your vehicle is equipped. Different vehicles have different ignition equipment accordingly. So we'll try to cover as much of that as we can today in the spark plugs in episode 1. And whether you always wanted to know the real answer to some of these questions, or you just like to be a very conscientious owner of your vehicle, which I love, it's good to stay on top of these things. Please enjoy our first episode of Spark Plugs, all you need to know. Okay, so we've got our assortment of plugs, and that looks like a random assortment here, but I assure you that these are all handpicked from different things that we've worked on here. I usually save them in order to either explain some of the things we're going to go over in the video today, or maybe I need a spare or something like that. And I guess the place to start with this is what kind of material is being used in here. We've got different sizes of center electrodes here. We'll get a little pen out to kind of point this out. That tiny little guy there, and this slightly larger guy here. What's going on with that? Well, what's going on with that is we have copper, we have platinum, and then we've got iridium. And these are the type of plugs that we'll run into these days with gasoline engines. Diesels aren't going to have any of these, and there may be some other kind of spark plugs with a different type of material that's been used in the past that I'm not covering here today. But what we want to cover here today is the stuff that we're going to run into in our everyday life as car owners. You know, maybe not every day, but sooner or later you're going to have to deal with this. So let's go over what we have going on here. Our copper is the oldest of the three here. It's kind of chronological, oldest, and then, you know, the guys in the middle child, and then we've got the youngest. The coppers deliver, or used to deliver at least by advertising, the hottest spark out of the three of these. Before this was around, we just had these two for a long time, and you had more of a hot spark out of this than you did this, because this is a softer metal, this is a harder metal. Because this is a softer metal, and the way that the nature of, you know, the spark jumping across from this, the ground strap, this outside guy here is called the ground strap, and then we have our center electrode, and our spark is going to jump across that you'll notice on that center electrode. It's got a little bit of a rounding, but not too bad. And what's happening is a little piece of metal is taken away every time a spark jumps across that gap. Each and every time. And there's many, many sparks just, you know, even sitting there idling. Now you see this guy here. This is what happens when you take a 30,000 mile plug out to about 110, 120,000 miles. It will take all of the material away, And you'll end up with, as you can see there between these two guys, that the gap opened up. And we all know, any of us that have messed around with spark plugs before, the gap is very important. The space, the amount of space between this ground strap and that center electrode is very, very important. It's measured in thousandths, you know what I mean? So you can imagine that when this was in the car, it was, passing a lot of gas, not making very complete spark, may have been a misfire, very poor fuel economy. That's what we can expect out of this, but it takes away a little piece of that metal. You see how that works out. So that's why a lot of times that your car starts to kind of run a little soggy with these guys, is because that gap has changed. And in the olden days, back in my father's time, I guess, or even before that, what a lot of guys would do is they would take some of this stuff here, emery paper, if you're not familiar, and it's just kind of like sandpaper, but on cloth, and they would kind of clean up between here and here, and try to close that gap back up. Now, what do I mean about trying to close that thing up? How do we know what's going on? Well, one of the simpler ways that you can deal with this is at the parts store, you have this little gapper tool here, and this is one from O'Reilly. They're like $1, I believe, or something like that, and you can see that we start all the way down here at 20 thousandths, and it goes all the way out to 80 thousandths. It may vary depending on what's going on, but usually what we're looking for, and these plugs here, these Champions, these all came from Dodges. Let's just say that a very common or popular spark plug gap for that would be 44 thousandths. So if this thing would focus for me, 44 thousandths is right before that main mark here. You see we have 40, and then 1, 2, 3, 4. So it would be 44 thousandths is what we're looking for. Now, these have all been in a car, so they've got varying gaps, but just for demonstrational purposes, we know that this has been in a car, and I would guess that this probably has been in there closer to that 30,000 miles that we would expect. And as we go around the dial here, it starts to snug up. And we're at about that 45, 46 mark when it's pretty snug. And that's what we've got going on. Now, what was neat about these old copper plugs is you would have the ability to check this stuff out and be able to see what's going on. You know what I mean? And if it was something where we pulled out the plugs and they looked like this, well, my. We can go ahead and take a look here and say, oh, well, I know I was supposed to be at 44 thousandths, and we're going past the 44 thousandths, and we're going all the way around to the 60 thousandths. I mean, this thing will even, because this is the insulator, the ceramic insulator that's around that center electrode, and it's worn down to the insulator there, so it's, I mean, we almost could stick the whole thing in there. That's craziness. So we had an idea. We could pull it out and see this and go, oh my God, these definitely need to be replaced. It was a little easier to figure out back in the day, or if you have a Dodge or a vehicle that does require copper plugs. What's interesting about these copper plugs also is sometimes at the parts store, they're going to try and sell you these guys, or they're going to try and sell you these guys. Now, in a situation with a Dodge that requires these kind of spark plugs, these coppers, you'll look at your catalyst sticker under your hood, and that sticker is going to show you a part number. And that part number usually corresponds with a spark plug, or if it's been updated or replaced, there should be a replacement for that in the parts numbers that lets you know that kind of a thing. But basically, they require this because the coil packs doesn't have a spark plug wire like one of these that you would see in some cars. It actually just has a coil pack, and that coil pack sits directly on here. No spark plug wire required, no ignition cap or ignition rotor, and you didn't have to worry about much with these guys, you know what I mean, as far as coppers running through the coil pack, because it was the right impedance. There's a certain amount of amperage that is provided, and with this softer metal that's in here with this copper, it's real easy for those coil packs to send the spark. But when we're dealing with these platinums, that same coil pack might have to work a little bit harder in order to try to deliver the same spark. So sometimes on something like a Dodge, you change your spark plugs to a set of these or a set of these, like the guy at the parts counter told you to do, because they know the spark plugs, they know the difference between all of these, and they know which one is more or less efficient out of the three of these versus each other. But they don't know the very specific data about your vehicle. You might have a Dodge, and it might be something where we change it out, and then you have 1, 2, 3 spark plug coils going out. They go out like light bulbs. They're not going to give you an indication of when something is wrong, when something's coming up. It's just not going to work one day, and you'll have a solid misfire. So important information to know about these. If your vehicle specifies it needs this, whether that's in your owner's manual or, like I said, on your catalyst sticker, you may find that it specifies a part number. A lot of times that will also specify the gap that we were going by that's here. If it's not something where you have a field service or a factory service manual, or you don't have your owner's manual, or your catalyst sticker doesn't show you, maybe something like 0.044, that would be that 44 thousandths, like I said, that we're looking for right here. That would have been something that we would have known right off the bat. And that's something more for a DIYer. If you're not working on your own car, you don't need to know that. But if they're going to replace your spark plugs in a shop, that's something you might want to know about. So now that we've gone over what's going on with our copper plugs, these guys typically are supposed to go 30,000 miles. These guys are typically supposed to go 100,000 miles. These guys are typically supposed to go 200,000 miles, is what they say. In my opinion, not feasible. This will deliver the best spark. This delivers a little less spark, but it's at the sacrifice of being able to have some longevity and not have to pull them out. On some vehicles, they're difficult to pull out, so maybe these are a good option. And then these guys, they say these will give the spark of this, if not better. I'm not entirely sure. I'm not entirely convinced that that's true. Being that we know that these need to be changed every 30,000 miles to give us a great spark, it seems that these are probably the ones we're probably going to run into the most. And these are our platinums. And if we look at that platinum kind of close, we can see that it's a little different than what we had going on here with the copper one. As you can see with the copper, a much larger center electrode, and with our platinum, it's a little tinier. Well, that platinum's pretty expensive stuff. So, and you probably don't, it's said that you don't need as much of the material. So that's an interesting thing, to take a look at, is that you don't have the opportunity to try and gap those. Where we were gapping these and we were checking these guys out with the gap tool that we had on our keychain here, we really don't want to be doing any of that because you'll snap that tiny little piece off of there. That's basically what could happen. And if you snap that off, you're going to have a misfire. It's not going to run right. It's going to be not very good. So this is how they come, typically it's going to be pre-gapped. And I mean, if you really wanted to check what was going on in there, sometimes it's worthwhile to see if that may have melted off. The center electrode had melted off. I believe this guy here is more of an example of that. As you can see, no platinum up at the top of that guy. It just kind of got burnt right off of there. Unfortunate stuff. Now we can look at this and we can see this is an NGK and there's a P. P is for platinum. If we go over here to one of these guys, our iridium plugs, and that one it's not as easy to see, I'm sure, because it's a little dirty, but this is a AC Delco iridium, and you can see it has the I in the part number. This isn't always going to be the case, but sometimes that helps me to remember. But if we were to look at an iridium and a platinum next to each other, you almost can't tell the difference. And once again, a very tiny amount of the iridium is on there. If we were to look at our typical run-of-the-mill platinum plug, you can see there's maybe less of that iridium on there than the platinum that we have in the platinum tipped plug. But that's what we're working with. Iridium is Also one of those plugs that you're not going to be gapping yourself. That's just not the way that those work out. If you do that, you run the risk of possibly breaking that iridium off of the end of that. So it seems to me that like newer motors, tighter tolerances and whatnot, might like these iridiums a little bit more. What I don't like about them is they do kind of run a little bit warm. And as we can see here, we don't have any kind of buildup of any kind, even though this is a used plug. But we do see where in the center there it's just all white center insulator. That's not exactly what I would consider an ideal situation. In fact, when I want an ideal situation, I run coppers. If you're running a power adder, nitrous supercharger, turbo, you're going to be loving these plugs. Those guys that are at the top of, the fastest of all of the engines, V8s, 4 cylinders, turbo, nitrous, race car guys, they're using coppers. They're not using these platinums or the iridiums. But you can see on the iridium, even though it burns pretty clean, what I want to see is that chocolate brown color on my center insulator here. And here we can see on the center insulator, it's just white. Now it's not crispy. If you open this up, or not open it up, if you pull this out of your engine and it's white and crusty, something kind of like what we're seeing here, a little bit of white and crustiness, and some of this is like a little bit of dustiness. It kind of floated around the workbench a little bit. But lean condition causes for that to be that white and crusty color, and what we want to see with an ideal condition is a chocolate brown, and this might even be a little bit past that chocolate brown. Here's another copper plug that, like I said, this one doesn't have a whole lot of mileage on it, but we can see, it's got that brown color. If it's black and sooty and dry, then we're running too rich. And unfortunately, I don't have an example of one of those here. I mean, if I was to not have this stuff that burned up on this, it probably would have looked that way. Another thing that we see here is it's a little bit of oily residue and buildup. That means that this thing is in a motor that's kind of worn out. Maybe we have a lot of blow by, the rings aren't sealing very well, and that's what happens when you have a lot of mileage on an engine. It lets some of that oil by and it gets burned, and so you might see a little bit of that going on. But back to the point, these things, not the ideal fuel mixture. Back in the day, old schoolers used to look at their plugs and look at that center insulator, and like I was saying, if it was white, it was lean. If it was chocolate brown, then we're probably at the right fuel mixture. And then if we had that black sooty color that was dry, then we're too rich. And that would also give us an idea of what we're working with as far as the heat range. On the part number here, we have a 12 there. Some plugs it's backwards and some plugs it's forwards. The higher the number, the more hotter the plug gets, or vice versa. But that's what old school hot rodders would do, is they would find out what plug works best with their vehicle by reading that very thing. And that's why we don't like these as hot rodders, because it's, even if I go with a colder heat range, it's still going to do this. These guys just kind of burn however it is that they want to burn. And if you're detonating, it's just going to detonate and you're going to be SOL. You're going to be out of luck. These are the platinum guys, and as you can see, they did pretty decently. They're not too terribly bad. We have some of that hint of chocolate color that's going on in there, and that's what we want to see. If you leave these in for too long, you'll see when you pull one out, it'll kind of have it melted off of there. And that, I believe, happens with these iridiums too. You can see here, this one's kind of, if we look really close, it's got a little lean on it. There's barely anything on there, if there's any iridium on there at all. It may have just melted it. We have to keep in mind, they joined this iridium with like a lesser metal. So it's like, how long is it going to be before it disconnects itself from there? And then we can see on this side, that's a nice tall little piece. Everything's looking pretty good there. Not nearly as many miles that were on there. And we have the same kind of plug, these AC Delcos. It's likely that these two plugs came out of the same engine. And why would it be that if they came out of the same engine, it could be that, okay, this one's got more mileage on it than this one, but I know that these came out of the same engine. And I can tell that this one took a lot more heat than this one did. So what was going on here? Well, maybe this particular cylinder was very lean compared to this cylinder. You don't always get the same even thing going across an engine, and that might give us an indication. Another top tip is looking at things like this, give us an indication of how that engine is running. if we're keeping track of which cylinder this came from. And if we were to run a compression test, it might be something where we see, man, this cylinder's got a lot less compression if we had like nitrous or turbo or supercharger on the engine, because maybe we went a little bit lean on that cylinder, and this is the beginning of where the problems are. But then right after it melts this little piece in the spark plug, then the next thing it's going to melt is going to be those rings or maybe pieces of your piston. So that's our talk about all of the different spark plugs here. That's just a basic overview. Some of our other videos may go more into depth about some of this stuff, and I'm sure we'll talk about it again. But that just gives you an idea of what we're working with different spark plugs, and we know what they look like when they're new, but we want to know what was going on with them when they are used. And the next thing we're going to take a look at and talk about is this, spark plug wires. All right, so now we get to the last part of our video, and this might be the coolest tip of the entire video in my opinion. But we're going to talk about these spark plug wires. A lot of newer cars have coil packs and don't have these, but if you do have these, then you're going to want to probably hear this. A lot of people have their own opinions about when these should be replaced. Obvious signs would be cracks in the insulation, something where we would be able to see a defect and bend it, and we would actually see the crack kind of stick out. This one is pretty decent shape. It's been on a car, not for a terribly long time, but on the vehicle this came off of, half of them were replaced and half of them were not. So we just went ahead and did all of them so we know when all of them were replaced at the same time. What we're going to do is, instead of just taking a look at it or trying to guess the mileage, or even if you do know the mileage, this isn't so much of an industry standard by mileage, and I'll show you what I mean. So the first thing that we need to test this out is we're going to need a multimeter. And I've got here probably one of the most basic multimeters. You can get these at Harbor Freight. They're very, very cheap. They may have different names on them here, but they look the same. These work okay for something like this. There are better, but this just shows you don't have to have the best tools to test something like this. So we're just going to have this thing turned on, and we have it set to 20K on the scale for ohms. This is our little ohms symbol. So right here, it's got a 1. And what generally happens is if the two leads touch something metal, if you don't know about this, it will give you the resistance between them. And it might be something where there's even resistance in the coating. So here, like, you know, we can kind of rub it around and get some different numbers, but it's going to show us resistance. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at our two connectors here. And we've got one that's inside of there, which I don't think we can really see on the camera there. So you can kind of see it down in there. There's a middle connector, so we're just going to kind of wedge this between the boot and that metal so that it kind of stays in place like that for us. And then we're going to take the positive probe here, and we're just going to touch the metal right here. We're going to see what we get. So as we do this, we see that 4.2. Let's see if that's what if we can get anything different. Press it down on there real hard, kind of scratch it around. But it looks like that 4.2 is about what's going on. Now what does this number mean, this 4.2? Well, what we're looking for is the service industry standard for this testing procedure is no more than 6 ohms of resistance per foot. So we just saw 4.25, like 4¼ ohms. And this wire, which we have a hard time showing on the camera here because I'm working on the bench, but as you can see as I stretch this out, this is a good maybe 2.5 feet long little cord here. So 4¼ ohms, that is not bad at all. We don't really have to worry about that. And that could have rode a little bit longer on that car for sure. That's well under the industry standard. Let's take a look here at a little older wire. This one has definitely done 100,000 miles. Even though it's done 100,000 miles and it's a little dirty, we don't want to, again, take that dirty is going to be the measure of what's bad or good. We can go along this thing and we can see some spots that look a little more questionable than others, but there's no physical damage that can be seen here. And there's no misfire code in the vehicle it came from. So what do? We're going to go ahead and do our little test. And if we look at this connector here, it could be something where, okay, let me look for a dirty connector or fouled up connector. You're not going to see that. These things stay pretty clean. They got these nice rubber boots. That's what we have going on. This particular spark plug wire is a lot shorter. This guy is just a little over a foot long, not as long as the other one. This is probably half the length. So even though that one's not new, it did show us pretty nice numbers. We know that these wires definitely have gone more miles. Let's do the test and find out just how bad they really are, because that's what we want to know. That's what we came here for. So again, we're going to drive that between the contact and the rubber boot. We're still set to 20K on our multimeter. And let's just touch this on here and see what we come up with. And you see we've got 8 ohms going on here. I can kind of rub it around and try to get a better contact. We'll try it again here. Yeah, see, we're back to 8 ohms again. So this definitely exceeds the factory standard for whether or not this is okay. And that's why this wire got replaced. It was replaced because it was outside of those tolerances. So we didn't guess. We looked at this wire, it looked okay, but based on the fact that it's providing that much resistance, if we were to take a brand new wire at this length, it would be even less than the 4 ohms over 2.5 feet that we saw on the other wire. So that gives you an idea. The more resistance there is inside this wire, the less spark is actually delivered to your spark plug. Now, if you're dealing with coil packs, then you're not worrying about this particular problem. There are problems that do come up with coil packs, but typically they work or they don't, or they will give you a misfire code on that cylinder. And what we would do is, if it kept giving us the code, we would clear the code again and again to see if it keeps coming up on the same cylinder. But you would see that on cylinder number 1 or 2. We would take that coil pack and switch it with cylinder number 4 or another cylinder that was not throwing the code. And the next time it throws the code, we would see if it throws it on 4. And if that happens, then we know that that coil pack is the problem. There are ways to test it with this as well, and we might get into that in a future video, but we're not going to get into that for this one. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please click that like button. Consider subscribing if you want to see more. The next video is going to be all about brakes, and we'll go over a lot of stuff with that. Please like, comment, subscribe. Comment down below what you might want to see next in the series, and we'll get the next one out next week. Thank you for watching.